Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well. 23. And just a little catch up before we get into that. In the last couple issues, Swamp Thing and his wife Abby met a couple of teenagers from Tulane University in Louisiana, and they met because they were at the new Sunderland Corporation toxic waste disposal site that is being built near Swamp Thing's house, and they were there destroying equipment because they are part of an eco group that goes around destroying property of companies that are destroying the environment. But these are just kids, so they get caught while they're doing this, and they ended up having to run through the swamp and get chased by a couple of men who were trying to kill them. And just when it looked like the bad guys were going to catch up with them, Swamp Thing appeared and saved the college kids. And he didn't kill the men, he just took their weapons and told them to get out of there. So those guys went back and reported to their boss that Swamp Thing was alive and well, and that he saved the kids that were destroying the equipment that night. And all this information gets back to the new leader of the Sunderland Corporation, and that person is General Sunderland's daughter, Connie Sunderland. And we also saw that those kids, once they got back to New Orleans, they were still trying to figure out a way to hurt the Sunderland Corporation. So one of the kids, named Otter, broke into the mainframe of the Sunderland Corporation to try to find some incriminating files on them. And he did get some information on something called Project Proteus, but that was not before he got caught by the cybersecurity, and they identified where he was and who he was. And when Connie Sunderland heard about this, she sent an assassin named the Needleman to take out Otter's professor, because the professor is actually the person that's been instigating and inspiring these kids to do some kind of action against these big corporations. And on the last page of last issue, we saw that the assassin, the Needleman, had gone to the college and killed the professor, and Otter ended up finding the professor dead in his office with his papers and stuff looking like they'd been gone through. And also in the background, in like a subplot, the gay roommate of Abby and Swamp Thing's friend Chester has had his lover move in, who's also black, and that has caused issues with the neighbor, who is racist and homophobic, and who also has connections with a local politician named Baron. So at the end of the last issue, we saw that Baron and the neighbor and some other people got together and put a burning cross on the lawn of Chester. And that catches us up with issue 123. So first things first, we got the cover here. We see a full moon in the background behind the towering shoulders of a giant Swamp Thing figure. Swamp Thing is looking down very angrily at a human man who is tangled up in Swamp Thing's vines. And that man has that needle weapon, so this must be the Needleman assassin. And we see that this book is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMulder. And we start off on the first page in the swamp in the middle of the night, and we cut inside of Swamp Thing's house, and he and Abby are sleeping. Actually, it looks more like Abby is sleeping and Swamp Thing is kind of just laying down, holding on to her. I guess Swamp Thing doesn't really need to sleep per se, so that makes sense. And all of a sudden, Abby is awoken by a thumping sound that's going on downstairs. And she says, "What? Alec?" And I guess Swamp Thing is pulled from his thoughts because he says, "What is it?" And she answers, "It sounds like there's somebody downstairs." So Swamp Thing gets up to go down and he says, "It will only take me a second to find out who it is." And Abby isn't hearing any of that. She whispers to him, "Oh no, you don't. You're not disappearing and leaving me here with nothing but one of your empty suits for protection." And I didn't mention it before, but Abby is completely naked, so I could definitely see how she wouldn't want to wait there naked and afraid. So Abby puts on a big t-shirt and they go downstairs together, and the thumping is coming from outside. So Swamp Thing goes to the door and begins to open it and says, "Whatever it is, it certainly isn't a burglar." And as they open the door, they are greeted by the completely exhausted figure of Otter, the college student. And he, of course, is soaking wet because apparently he has walked through the swamps to get to Swamp Thing's house, and his clothes are all torn. In fact, the way he's lit, he kind of looks like a zombie. And he says to them, "Help me. They're after me. I need sanctuary." And we see that the name of this issue is called Punctures. So Otter stumbles into Swamp Thing's house through the door and collapses into Swamp Thing's arms. And Abby asks, "Good Lord, Otter, what happened?" And as Swamp Thing sets him down in a chair, Otter answers, "They killed the prof. I'm certain of it." And Swamp Thing asks, "Someone's dead?" And Abby gets Otter a glass of water, and while she's handing it to him, he says, "Professor Johnson's dead. I found him in his office at the university. Someone had been through his records before I even got there. I was supposed to meet him and show him what I found when I broke into the Sunderland Corporation's computer." And then Otter begins remembering the horrific face of Professor Richardson dead on the desk, and he puts his head in his hands and he says, "But when I got there, oh my God, it's my fault he's dead. My fault." And Abby immediately goes over to him trying to comfort him, saying, "I don't want to hear any more talk like that. It's not your fault he's dead, no matter how it happened. Now, let's get you cleaned up and go to bed. We'll try to make sense of what's going on in the morning, okay?" And as they go upstairs to show Otter to the guest room, Lady Jane comes out holding Tefe and says, "Madam, is there trouble?" And Abby answers her, "We've just got an unexpected overnight guest, Lady Jane. Nothing to worry about. I hope." Then we cut to Swamp Thing, who's thinking as he looks out the window and then walks along his outdoor balcony, and he thinks, "It could be nothing. A simple burglary gone tragically wrong. But why do I feel that's what we're supposed to think? If it were anyone else besides Sunderland. I know the old bastard is dead and rotting in hell, but I can't help feel his twisted hand in this. Perhaps I'm just being paranoid." Then we cut to the next day where Abby is walking in Houma, Louisiana, and it turns out she is visiting the Swamp Thing family friend Chester. And she notices as she goes onto his property that his mailbox is all messed up and there's a burnt, scorched section of his grass. And as she approaches his porch, she is greeted by Chester's roommate Carl and his boyfriend Troy, and they are holding boxes. And Abby asks, "Carl, Troy, what's going on here?" And as Carl and Troy walk past her with boxes, Carl answers, "We're moving out." And Abby questions, "Moving? But Troy just moved in a couple days ago." And then Troy answers, "Yeah, but that was before I realized I wasn't welcome." And Abby doesn't quite understand, but Chester comes out and explains everything, saying, "The clan burned a cross on our lawn last night, Abby. Troy and Carl refused to stay another night. I can't say I blame them." And Abby replies, "Chester, I'm so sorry. Have you reported this to the police?" And Chester looks at her cynically and says, "Oh yes, and I don't doubt a few of Huma's finest helped light the damn thing. I don't expect much to come from the investigation." And then Chester changes the subject and says, "So what brings you to town?" And Abby says, "I need to borrow your phone again." And Chester replies, "Nothing serious, I hope?" And Abby says, kind of jokingly, "Just a slight touch of death so far." And I didn't mention this when we first saw her, but Abby is wearing a swimsuit that's like a one-piece and some jean cutoff shorts over that. So everything's really tight and form-fitting, and this comes into play because Chester's house is now being watched, specifically by the racist neighbor, and it also turns out that Baron himself is in his car watching from afar as Abby is talking to Chester. And Chester's neighbor's talking to him through the backseat window, and he's saying, "That's her, Mr. Baron. That's the swamp floozy that hangs out with all them no-good commies and bums over there. I tell you, she's in and out of that house all hours of the day and night. And the way she walks around, leaving nothing to the imagination, the things I could tell you." And the man whose name Mr. Boudreau is cut off by Baron as he says, "I'm sure that won't be necessary, Mr. Boudreau, but I do appreciate you bringing such reprehensible behavior to my attention." And then they begin to drive away, and Baron rolls up his window and he begins to tap his fingers together in front of his face as he plans evilly, and he says, "I'm sure I'll be able to do something about it." Then we cut back inside Chester's house as Abby is making her phone call, and she is calling one of the other kids that's friends with Otter, and her name is Michelle. And we're only hearing Abby's side of this conversation, so she's saying, "Otter showed up at our place last night, babbling about the professor being dead, and then he is dead. Did the papers say what of? I see. Yes, I'll be certain to tell him next time I see him." And the whole time, Chester has been standing here next to her making some coffee, and you would think that he would have overheard that exactly, but he doesn't, and he asks what that was about. And Abby says, "Professor Johnson's dead." And then Chester begins to spill the coffee that he's pouring because of the shock of hearing the professor is dead. And then Abby explains exactly what happened, saying, "Otter was supposed to meet the professor last night to discuss some information he managed to download from the Sunderland computers. But when he got there, the professor was dead, and it looked like his office had been searched. According to the papers, it was a routine burglary, but there's something about the whole thing that's just not right. Either way, It's such a shame to lose a fine teacher. Then we cut back to the swamp at Swamp Thing's house, where he and Otter are talking, and Otter is saying, in the light of day, everything I was scared of about last night seems like... And then Swamp Thing cuts him off saying, a bad dream. And Otter continues, yeah, I just keep telling myself I'll wake up and the prof will still be alive. And then Otter stops talking because of his sadness, and Swamp Thing puts his big green hand on Otter's shoulder to try to comfort him, and Otter asks, am I being paranoid? Who would want to kill the professor just to get at me? Sure, I may have cost Sunderland a couple of front loaders, but that's hardly a reason to send out an assassin. And as Swamp Thing answers Otter, he goes over to the ground because all these little flower people are running around. If you remember from the last issue, Tefe, his daughter, who was part human, part demon, and part green elemental, she was trying to learn from Lady Jane how to grow flowers, and she accidentally ended up growing some flowers that are somewhat alive. They can run around and whatnot. They have faces, but according to Swamp Thing, they're not totally conscious. And in the last issue, Swamp Thing made note that he didn't think they were dangerous or anything bad could happen from them. So Swamp Thing bends down to pick one up and he says, you said something about a computer file. And Otter replies, yeah, but there's nothing really to that. Most of it requires high security clearance codes. What I have is little more than a skeleton. It concerns something called Project Proteus. I couldn't tell if it involved bioengineering or toxic waste management. And as he was talking, Swamp Thing had picked up one of those flowers and kind of mused at it a little bit and then put it back down to let it go run with its friends. And he asked Otter, so you don't understand why Sunderland should see you as a threat? And Otter replies, nope. It's really creepy that a big corporation like that is watching every move I make. It's scary enough when you realize how much of America's day-to-day life is controlled by these invisible corporate greed heads to begin with. But when one of these companies suddenly decides to squish you like a bug, what the hell could an average Joe do? So the reason why I talked about the flowers is because the last stuff that Otter said was narration over a couple of different panels, and they're panels of the flowers playing, and then the flowers seeing a toad, and then the flowers picking up pointy sticks, and it looks like they're about to murder this toad. So I don't know if they're trying to imply that these are evil flowers now, or something ill is going to come from Tefe's creations, or if this is just an easy way to kind of allude to the Needleman, or I guess it could be both. But either way, it's super messed up looking to see these little happy flowers try to murder something. So then we cut to Michelle and Spike, Otter's two friends, and they're driving to Huma in order to pick up Otter. And Spike is asking Michelle, I don't know, do you think we ought to be doing this? And Michelle replies, Spike, Otter's our friend and he needs our help. And Spike says, yeah, I know, but that's not what I'm getting at. If someone really did ice the professor trying to get to Otter, wouldn't they, be watching us? I mean, what if we're being followed? And Michelle turns to him from the driver's seat, taking her eyes off the road, which is very unsafe, and says, you're as bad as Otter. Seeing conspiracies everywhere where you look, no wonder he wigged out when he found the professor's body. And then Spike looks at her seriously and asks, so you don't think the prof was murdered? And Michelle replies, I don't know what to think. All I know is we need to get Otter and take him home before anything else happens. And then we see as she says this, in the rearview mirror, she's not paying attention to it, but there is a pair of headlights following them down the road. Then we cut to Chester's house in Huma, and I forgot to mention this before, but that conversation in the car between Spike and Michelle was at nighttime, so it's still the same night, and we see in Chester's house all the lights are on, and when we cut to the inside, Chester is walking around the now empty house. Carl has moved out with his boyfriend, and it seems like Chester is kind of sad about that because Chester's girlfriend had left him just prior to this. So having Carl there and Carl's boyfriend was kind of nice to not be in a house alone. So we're seeing a bunch of different silent panels of Chester walking around, and they're definitely showing us Chester walk by pictures of happy pictures of Chester and his old girlfriend, Liz Tremaine, hanging on the wall, almost like they're haunting him. And then Chester goes to sit on the lazy boy in the middle of the living room, and we see him look towards the front door, and it seems like he's added a couple locks on top of his normal door handle lock because there's a bolt now, and there's also one of those hotel chain locks on it. And we also see there is a shotgun sitting by the door. So it seems like Chester is prepared for the worst. Then we cut to the outside of his house where Michelle and Spike have just pulled up. And if you're wondering why they're going to Chester's house instead of straight to Swamp Thing's, it's because they don't know how to get to Swamp Thing's house. So they need to ask Chester for directions. So as Spike and Michelle get out of the car, They see the lights are on, so they know someone's at home. So Michelle begins to walk towards the house, and she says to Spike, who's following her, "I just hope it's not too late to try to get out there." And Spike says, "Yeah, I would hate to try to find Swampy's crib again without a guide." And then Michelle says, "Come on, the sooner we get this over with, the sooner we can go home." And then as Spike is about to say something back to her, all of a sudden, his first word is cut off and he falls to the ground. And Michelle sees this and thinks he's messing around and says, "Spike, you better not be goofing on me." And then as she kneels down next to Spike's limp body, she touches him to see if he's okay. And when she pulls back her hand, she's horrified to see it's covered with blood. Then something glinting in the moonlight catches her eye, so she looks to see what it is, and in the bushes kind of close to her is a man standing holding a large needle. And she finally understands that this was not some kind of conspiracy theory that Otto was talking about. This is real. People are trying to kill them. So she says, "Oh, no, no, no." And she runs as fast as she can over to Chester's door and begins pounding on it. Now, of course, Chester is on the inside of that door thinking that the KKK is coming back to his house tonight. So when he hears this pounding, he gets out of his chair and grabs his gun, and he opens the door quickly and points the gun at Michelle without realizing that it's her. And he says, "What the hell do you people want from me?" And luckily, Chester is not a trigger-happy person because he does not fire immediately as Michelle bursts through the door and into his arms yelling, "He's dead! Spike's dead!" And luckily, it seems like the man that was watching her from the bushes with the weapon was not chasing after her because Chester's able to shut the door and he says, "You're Michelle, aren't you? One of Abby and Alex's friends? Calm down and tell me what's happened, okay?" So with tears in her eyes, she begins to tell him what happened, saying, "Spike and I drove up here to find Otter. We came to your place since you knew how to get to Abby and Swamp Thing. Then when he got out of the car, Spike made this funny noise and fell down. He was dead. And there was someone standing in the dark watching me." So then Otter goes over to his curtains and looks out the window and he says, "You saw someone? Could you make out who it was?" And Michelle replies, No, it was too dark." Now, I guess Chester being angry about the KKK and being emboldened by having a weapon kind of makes him stupid because he decides to go outside and check out what's going on. So as he walks out, he tells Michelle, "Maybe your friend isn't dead after all. Come on, let's go see for ourselves. Don't worry, I'll lock the house so no one will get in while we're out." So Michelle guides Chester back to where Spike had fallen down in the grass. But when they get there, Spike's body is no longer there. And she says, "I could have sworn this is where it happened." And Chester kind of kneels down and looks at the area and says, "Something heavy's been recently dragged from here." And then Michelle asks, "Why would he take Spike's body?" And then Chester stands up and kind of looks around and says, "Whoever it is doesn't want us calling in the cops." So since they can't think of anything else to do, Chester decides that he's going to take Michelle to Swamp Thing's house. So he gets in the car with her and begins to drive. So on the way there, she says, "I don't like this, Chester. We're practically leading the killer to Otter." But Chester's not stupid. He knows what he's doing. And he says, "Don't you think I know that? But we don't have anything to call the cops about. And if we don't do something, he might decide to strike at one of us to get results. Besides, if Alec can't get to the bottom of this, no one can." So then we cut to a couple minutes later where the van has been parked on the side of the road and Chester is guiding Michelle into the swamp by foot. And Chester still has his gun and he tells Michelle, "We'll have to walk the rest of the way. Be careful with the flashlight. It's the only one I've got." And as Michelle wades into the thigh-high water, she says, "Believe me, I'm not about to drop it." And then I guess because she's holding the flashlight and that's the only source of light, she walks in front of Chester even though he's got a gun, which is kind of unsafe. So as they get closer to Swamp Thing's house, the water gets less deep. So now it's only up to their ankles. And it seems like that means they're pretty close to Swamp Thing's house. But something's been bothering Michelle as she thinks about this killer. And she asks Chester, "Do you think we might have lost whoever it was that followed me and Spike?" And Chester answers, "It's possible. Not a lot of people know how to get to this part of the bayou." And Michelle seems comforted by that because she says, "Good. That makes me feel a little bit better." But just as she says that, we look above Chester and we see that the Needleman assassin is sitting on the branch just above him, and he jumps down with his needle poised to kill Chester. And when he falls onto Chester, he doesn't stab him immediately. It seems Chester is able to grab the hand, but the gun goes off. And then we cut to inside Swamp Thing's house, where Swamp Thing and the family are sitting with Otter at the dinner table. And they hear the shotgun blast because it's pretty close by. And Tefe even mimics the sound, saying, boom. Then we cut back to Chester and the Needleman, and they are wrestling in the water. Of course, because the Needleman came from above, he is on top of Chester, and the Needleman is struggling to stab at Chester, but Chester has some pretty good ground defense because he's got Needleman tangled up in his legs, and then he's also got pretty good control over the wrist and arm of the weapon hand. And Michelle, of course, is freaked out, so she runs in the direction of the swamp house. I'm not sure if she can see it exactly, but she begins to yell, Otter, Abby, someone help. Then we cut back to the fight, and we get possibly my favorite panel in this whole issue. We get a Chester point of view shot of the Needleman, so we're staring up at the assassin's face, and of course he looks crazed and angry and excited. And the Needleman wears glasses as well, so his glasses have fallen down and are hanging by his chin, and we can see the eyes of Chester reflecting in them, and they look terrified. And we see Chester's death grip on the wrist of the weapon hand, but it does look like he's losing. But luckily for Chester, we also get a panel where we see behind Needleman, and just behind his feet, we see some vines begin to grow. And all of a sudden, when it looks like the Needleman is about to stab Chester, he's engulfed with vines and pulled back. And the vines actually pull him back and into the air. So he's hanging tangled with his arms and legs outstretched as the vines kind of wrap around him. And the Needleman's face looks freaking insane. He still has his weapon in his hand, by the way. And then Swamp Thing, Abby, and Otter appear, and Swamp Thing says to Chester, "Are you all right?" And as Chester gets up from the swamp, he says, "Nothing broken except my shotgun." And then Michelle, who sees Otter, gets very excited and runs over to him and says, "Otter, thank God you're okay." And she gives him a big hug. And of course, he's happy to see her because I think that there's supposed to be an item, but he's also looking around for someone else. And he says, "What are you doing here? Where's Spike?" And then she pulls back and looks at him, and we see tears falling from her eyes. And she says, "Spike's dead, Otter. He killed him." So Swamp Thing walks over to the Needleman and looks at him and says, "Why did you do these things?" And then Swamp Thing grabs him by the shirt and says, "I know Sunderland is behind all this." And the Needleman says, "I will not betray the general's trust in me by talking to the enemy." And then Swamp Thing replies angrily, "The general is dead. I should know. I killed the old man myself, and I've seen his miserable soul roasting in hell where it belongs." And then Swamp Thing points at Otter and Michelle hugging, and he says, "Why would your master spend so much time and energy going after harmless college students? They knew nothing of Sunderland's plans. They were no threat." And the Needleman doesn't look intimidated at all by Swamp Thing. He looks like he's got a trick up his sleeve or something as he says, "You want to know why they were marked for death, monster? Very well, I will tell you why." And then I guess because the vines aren't extremely tight, they're just kind of holding him in the air, he's able to shift his weight, and that gives him the leverage that he needs in order to stab at Swamp Thing with his weapon. So the Needleman lunges forward and yells, "Because they were friends of yours!" And he's able to stab Swamp Thing in the eye with his 18-inch long needle weapon. And this thing goes through Swamp Thing's head completely, like it's poking out the back a good 9 inches. And in this panel where the attack is happening, Swamp Thing looks like he's stunned and he's falling backwards, like not in pain, but this might have done something to him. But when we turn the page, we see, no, it didn't do anything. He is bleeding like chlorophyll from his eye hole where the weapon is sticking out. But he just pulls it out and there's no damage, of course, and he says, "Nice try. I am afraid I'll still have to turn you over to Officer Rawls." And the Needleman, who's still hanging, yells out, "You'll never get me to betray the general. Never!" And then he bites down hard on one of his teeth, and that tooth cracks, and all of a sudden, some kind of gas begins to release from the tooth. And that gas is definitely poison because it begins to take effect immediately, and the last words of the Needleman are, "Long live the general." And with that, the Needleman is dead. And Chester and Swamp Thing are staring at the man hanging there. And Chester says to Swamp Thing, "Man, these dudes play serious hardball, don't they?" Then we cut to the next morning where we see the kids and Otter are about to leave Swamp Thing's area of the swamp. But before they do, Otter tells Swamp Thing, "There's no way we can truly repay you for all the help you've given us." And Swamp Thing says, I do not expect any payment except that you continue to work to help the environment. And Otter and Michelle both say, you got it. And then Abby goes over to Michelle and gives her a kiss on the cheek and asks, so what are your plans? And Michelle answers, we think we'll go underground for a while, at least until Sunderland forgets who we are, if ever. And then Abby tells her, be careful. A little paranoia can be healthy, but don't let it get the better of you. We had a couple of friends who, well, one of them's dead and the other's just getting back to normal. And then Otter tells her, don't worry. I don't think we'll turn into Life During Wartime by the Talking Heads. We're going up to Colorado for a while. Things should be mellower there. I hope. And then Otter turns to Chester and says, it was really great getting to meet you, man. And Chester replies, same here. And then they shake hands. And then Michelle runs over to Chester and gives him a big hug and says, you're a really wonderful, brave man, Chester. You saved my life. I'll never forget that. And then Chester gets all embarrassed and says, well, And then I guess he doesn't finish his sentence because the next panel we see is Michelle and Otter walking off out of the swamp. And as Swamp Thing, Abby, and Chester watch them walk away, Abby turns to Chester and says, they're nice kids. I hope everything goes well for them. How about you, Chester? And then Chester kind of scratches his head and says, I've been doing some thinking. Maybe it's time I did more, became more involved. And Abby asks, what do you mean, Chester? You're already involved in at least a half dozen environmental and political groups. And Chester answers, no, I mean actually contributing something of myself. My knowledge, my ideals. Maybe it's time I went back to school and finished my degree. Became a teacher. And then he starts walking to leave and he finishes saying, at any rate, it's something worth considering. And then he vanishes into the foliage of the swamp. And then we're just left with Swamp Thing and Abby. And Abby turns to Swamp Thing and says, Alec, do you think Otter and Michelle will be okay? Will Sunderland leave them alone? And Swamp Thing answers, what concerns me is whether Sunderland will leave us alone. Then we cut to the Sunderland Corporation building in Washington, D.C., where Connie Sunderland is on the phone in her office, and she's replying to her assistant saying, yes, Smithers, I saw the report. Yes, it's a shame about Dr. Needleman. Unfortunately, he wasn't quite the man for the job. It's just that he seemed so convenient at the time. Yes, I think a nice floral tribute, anonymously donated, would be a nice touch. I wouldn't worry over much, Smithers. After all, the world is full of Dr. Needlemans. And as she says that last line, she has a big evil grin on her face. So it looks like the Swamp family is going to have a lot of assassins being sent after them by the Sunderland Corporation. And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember to stay swampy.